Council. My name is Pam Weegan. I'm the chair of the CJCC. This is our first hybrid meeting in 3 years. So we're really excited. So be patient. We may have some glitches as we move forward. I'll let Sarah go ahead and talk about the mics and then we'll proceed with other rules.
Thanks, Pam. These mics, we're kind of still on temporary mics in this room after our small water disaster. So you can move the whole mic or you can just pick up and do the handheld piece. You do need to turn it on here at the side and it will light up, and then you can turn it off. But we do need you to speak into microphones so that the folks on Zoom can hear us and so that we can record it. So turn it back over to you, Pam.
Thank you. I'm going to just pass on a little bit of information about about how we're going to conduct the meeting. So we're going to ask the members that are on Zoom, please turn on video if you have it. We ask that all members on Zoom mute their line when not speaking. We ask that you please identify yourself each time you speak so those in the room and those on Zoom can know who's speaking. And we are asking that if you have public comment to make at the end of the meeting, if you're on Zoom, please use the raise your hand function, or if you're here in person, just go ahead and raise your hand. Recordings of the CJCC meetings are available on the CJCC website after each meeting. I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome our newest CJCC board members, City Commissioner Brad Finkeldye and County Commissioner Shannon Reed. Thank you for coming. Our first item on today's agenda is the 2023-2024 CJCC work plan presentation and discussion with CJCC coordinator Katie Fitzgerald. Katie.
Thank you, Pam. Do I need to move close? I move closer here. Hold on. To hold it the whole time. Okay, let me try this. Okay, so we've talked for the last several months about kind of reworking, thinking about the next steps and vision for CJCC. So today I am going to present some recommendations, suggestions based on the work that you all have previously done over the last, not just the last strategic plan, but since the inception of CJCC, and building on in December at our last meeting, we had our presentation of all of the work that the Vera Institute of Justice had done, evaluating jail population and using their recommendations. So today I was going to walk through kind of the background, where we find ourselves today, and some suggestions for moving forward. So CJCC, as many of you all know, was established by the county commissioners by resolution in March of 2016. During that time, we have done a lot of work around behavioral health and the intersection in the justice system, particularly initiatives like Stepping Up, crisis intervention, and mobile response. Racial and ethnic disparities in the criminal justice system, particularly in the last couple of years, has really been an area of focus that the CJCC has really dove into, and work in that space. We've built out a lot of data. You all have seen a lot of data presentations from Matt Cravens around racial disparities, not just in the jail, but looking at decision points across the system. The law enforcement contact study was also part of the work that came out of the racial and ethnic disparities work from CJCC. Building out data capacity, especially in the last couple of years, has been a big lift from staff, particularly Matt, to build out. We've seen He's established the dashboards for the jail population and stepping up, a lot of reports and evaluation, and really utilizing data to help inform decisions made by CJCC as a whole and also CJCC member agencies. Particularly the last 3 years of the CJCC work plan, there was a particular focus around exploring use of diversion, expanding alternatives to incarceration and pretrial release. So there's been a lot of work in those areas to bring new programming on board and expand the services previously offered. And over the last probably 7 years at least, we've seen a significant expansion of services within the Douglas County Correctional Facility, including expanded and more broad provision of services through the reentry staff, and building out behavioral health services that are made available through agencies like Burt Nash and DECA. So I share that to kind of ground us in where we have been today, or where we have been up to this point. And so that we don't lose sight on the fact that Douglas County has done a lot of work over the last several years. So as many of you all may remember, back in the fall, we launched a survey to CJCC members, staff of their agencies, and we also made it available to community members to provide input and ideas, feedback about what the CJCC should consider, what are some of the pressing issues that that our staff and that our community members feel to consider. We received a significant number of responses. We had 127 responses. 10 were from identified themselves as current or past CJCC members. There was a lot of information to look at and kind of sort through with that. The comments, particularly for me, I found very insightful too. And the comments is where I found a lot of kind of common themes that I thought were important to share with you all to kind of lay the groundwork for where we may want to consider moving forward. In particular, the comments that stood out for me, there was a lot of feedback around the CJCC focus not being very clear from members, and then also a lot of the community. Goals of the CJCC and progress and action made on those goals were also not necessarily clearly delineated or disseminated to people. A lot of feedback around considering where we have opportunities to increase our visibility and communication with the community, not just about our collective outcomes as a system or as a jurisdiction, but agency-specific information as well. And I think that's important. I think we heard some public comment as well in December around opportunities for increased communication. And the last, and I know that we heard comments around this as well, but there's opportunity to seek alignment with CJCC to existing work and existing work groups, additional topics. We hear a lot in the community through our city council meetings, through our county commission meetings, and through all of the connections that that our members have. We're all working in a similar space, and the CJCC itself does not necessarily need to either reinvent the wheel or kind of own or take on a lot of the work in those spaces to serve our community, but there's opportunities to seek alignment and be able to share that information, that work more meaningfully. So as we think about selecting new goals moving forward, some considerations that I would suggest, if we think about kind of tangible, I hate to use the SMART goals, but we hear about SMART goals a lot, right? Measurable, actionable, realistic. But thinking about selecting a few goals that we can really commit to making progress on. And certainly when we think about the recommendations from Vera, there were a lot of recommendations. And there's a lot of places and a lot of opportunity that we have to really make more of an impact, kind of move the needle. Instead of taking all those on at one time, I think more about taking a bite out of the elephant, like a few things that we can really commit and dive into. Actionable and measurable goals. I think it's really important for us to consider taking on goals that our agency executives can also support and really buy into. And in terms of, I think it's important to think about building momentum. And there are some things that we can do in a more shorter term versus things that are much longer term. And so a good mix of those types of goals, I think, would be important for us to consider. So I have, as I think about some of these conversations that I've had, oh goodness, what do I was going to try to move that. See, it's not showing that way on my screen.
Oh, that's an Eric.
Yeah, that might be Eric's computer back there. And he may not be here with us. We'll fix that. So the suggestions that we'll walk through today are first that I would say a starting point. It's not an exhaustive list of all of the things that we need to work on. I tried to pick some of the things that communication or that there have already been conversations around, that there's already been some kind of momentum, and some of the larger areas, some of the things that are much more pressing that we know need some attention. I've talked with a lot of stakeholders throughout this process since the December meeting to get a sense of feedback around timing, ideas, things like that. And I would suggest too that as we think about these, that we consider a lot of the work that we have done, and I think we talked about this when during Vera's presentation, that we're kind of at the next step where we start to dig into the muscle. Like this is the next layer of continuing the work that for the last at least 7 years, the jurisdiction has undertaken. I've broken some of these out into the first 3 or first 5, I think, are topics that are more focused within and more kind of clearly delineated in CJCC agency purview. So they're a little bit more focused with work that we all here can take up. The last part are things that reach beyond just CJCC. So they're things that involve members from other aspects of our human services and community. And I would stress these again are just our recommendations. They're open to subject to change at the will of CJCC. So this was just a place I figured we could start conversation. Some of these, like the first one, are not new topics. We talked in the fall about trying to implement a regular jail review process. And I think it's important that we think about revisiting this, and within thinking about, there's lots of barriers, but there's also different ways that we can approach this through individual case review, which is challenging at the moment without a bids office. There are population specific ways that we could look at the jail population. So things like the next two things, thinking about failure to appear, alternative responses to probation violations. But within the context of how can we implement a regular review of our jail population, I think where we're at with that is having discussion, and I would encourage people to think about how can we maximize or utilize the resources we currently have to facilitate that in a meaningful way. Some key stakeholders there, obviously the sheriff's office, pretrial services, municipal and district court, and the district attorney's office. So I think there's a more conversation to have around that for us to identify kind of what that looks like. How can we make the most of what we have in that space right now? Recognizing that should we get an institutional defender's office, there could be some additional changes there. And I know when I've talked with some of you all, I can flesh a lot more of this out in specific actions or strategies, but also didn't want to like dump all of that, right? So the second, failure to appear defendants, particularly in the jail. When we think this was a population that was very clearly identified by the Vera staff as a driver and contributor to our jail population. When we think about failure to appear, a lot of times there's kind of two prongs to addressing that. The first is thinking about how can we improve court appearance rates. So those are not necessarily related to the issuance of an order for arrest, but those are things where we think about how are we maximizing information available to defendants about where can you find your court date? What are the options for if you're not going to be able to attend? How can you let the court know? I think in particular, now that the Self-Help Center is here, we have it. I think I would suggest that there's room in that particular topic for the director there to play a role. I would say around improving court appearance rates, there's also a lot of work, resources that have been kind of created by, in particular, the University of North Carolina School of Government has a innovation lab that they take on criminal justice issues, and what they try to do is create kind of a plug and play toolkit. They just wrapped up at the end of last year a very large project around court appearance, and there are potentially some good resources that, again, without us needing to reinvent the wheel, we could kind of just adjust those to our jurisdiction. The other prong to failure to appear approaches is when an order for arrest has to be issued. Are there alternative responses to a jail rather than booking someone in jail? With this particular aspect of failure to appear, I think it's important for us to remember we do have two distinct courts that likely have two distinct processes, particularly the Lawrence Municipal Court and then our district court. And so I think I would suggest that there's probably a lot more kind of information gathering, process mapping that may need to be done around better understanding how each of those courts approach failure to appear. When I've listed key stakeholders, I would say those are also not exhaustive lists. Those are just at top of mind, kind of who the agencies that I think are leaders in that space. And so under failure to appear, again, back to municipal and district courts. And I did add the Self-Help Center because I think there are opportunities for us to be able to capitalize at some point on that as a resource.
Katie, can I ask a quick question? I know municipal court and district court, Lawrence Municipal Court and district court are kind of the key stakeholders there. Do we know about Eudora and Baldwin Municipal Courts and whether or not what their failure to appear process is, or whether or not we're seeing bookings into the jail for that from them?
I would say offhand, we don't.
Okay.
And when we think about municipal court, I think it is important for us to think about, we do have the three, Lawrence being the primary driver that we see, but to be sure that we're inclusive of Baldwin and Eudora as well.
Yeah, it seems like a great opportunity to create some continuity about what is mutually beneficial to the courts and folks going to all of those courts.
The last one here, thinking about the jail population, and these, like I said earlier, failure to appear and probation violations can be considered as part of this larger jail review process. I included this topic based on, I'd had lots of conversations with Pam, not to put you on the spot, but different conversations. It sounded like responding to probation violations other than a jail booking has been something previously discussed, and there had previously been kind of conversations or ideas put forward, strategies thought that have already kind of been thought about or considered. And so I felt like this might be, there's already been some groundwork laid there. And so again, with this one, I would say we have multiple agencies that could be contributing to this. So all of our municipal courts potentially have responses to probation that are likely different from how our court services responds, which could be different than how our community corrections responds. And so similar to some of the failure to appear, I think a good starting place for this is to really understand how, like what happens when folks are on probation within these different agencies. And when there is a violation, kind of what's the threshold? There may be different thresholds of types of violations that before someone's brought back to court. I think there's more information gathering needed around this topic as well. And Pam, I don't know if you want to.
I was going to say, as you all may remember, Douglas County is participating in the MacArthur Foundation Safety and Justice Challenge around probation. And court services and community corrections are part of that work with MacArthur. And we're talking about, I think there are 8 other jurisdictions across the nation are part of this Safety and Justice Challenge. And we're looking at what other agencies are doing across the nation in terms of how they respond to probation violations. And so we want to kind of move that work forward in the CJCC and hopefully adopt some of the things we're learning in this network and maybe make some options and alternatives in our response grids in court services and community corrections. And hopefully we can also look at municipal court and how we respond to violations there, since we know that's a big driver in the number of folks in jail. PVs is one of the top jail reasons. And so we want to take a deeper dive in the data and figure out what is the driving, which agencies drive that, and what are the causes for those PVs. So we're excited about taking on that challenge. Thank you.
And thinking about the jail population related to probation violations, I think that group has defendants who come in on just a probation violation, I think tend to also have a longer length of stay. So there may not be as many people, but when they have longer lengths of stay, they're contributing to that, to the population, because they're not moving as quickly out of custody. So go ahead, Commissioner.
Thanks, Katie. Well, you just spoke about what my question was going to be, which is, I think, and part of that sort of deeper dive and understanding and sort of mapping out how that's going, knowing what the length of stay and what, like how many times people are getting a PV and then serving out an underlying sentence versus some shorter sanction that may be given by the officer, and to understand the nuances there. And additionally, whether or not there's any statutory reasons that, sort of dictate based on different levels of probation, what somebody is violated for, and also how long they will stay seems really important.
Yeah, I think with several of these, there will be a lot of kind of the next step will be a lot of data, like very specific, kind of lots of data that we'll need Matt to help us with and pull. So I had another thought about probation and I lost it. It might come back. These last two, under thinking about kind of the purview of CJCC, are things that are not quite as ready, I think, for us to really take on. Competency, we've heard a lot. I think Sheriff Armbruster has talked a lot to us about these folks. We've heard a lot about are folks who locally kind of seem to get kind of caught in this competency restoration cycle. We know they have long lengths of stay in custody before they're able to receive restoration services. Bob Tryansky and I have taken on some initial kind of conversations around trying to better understand the processes that defendants are going through and where we see that impacting not just on the jail population, but kind of across the system. We are a part of a jail-based restoration pilot program that we know in the fall, we started to see a lot of those clinicians, I guess, kind of come to, I'm not sure exactly if we would call them clinicians, but we've started to see a lot of folks in the fall who were part of that jail-based restoration program. Bob has kind of started making some connections to help us better understand what resources may be available to kind of help us maximize the opportunity to really utilize that, get the most out of that program when we have it available for our defendants who are in custody. I think with this topic, there's a little bit more information Bob and I need to gather before we kind of come back to you all to lay out kind of what work we should take on here, where this should go. Pretrial defendants, certainly the biggest portion of our jail population are folks who are pretrial. We, in conversation, I think there's a lot to kind of unpack around pretrial, not just pretrial services, but the pretrial phase of justice. There's probably a lot of potential avenues under better serving our pretrial defendants. I think a lot of that work is likely, we're better positioned later in the summer to really kind of dive into that for a couple of reasons. One is going back to bids. If we are a jurisdiction that is able to get an institutional defender office, we would know that later. That office would be an important part of any work around pretrial that any potential changes or work that we did around pretrial defendants. We will not know that, and potentially they would not be open until later this year. We also have, Judge McCabery has implemented a rotation of judicial appointments through the first appearance. There's a rotation of judges through first appearance hearings. And we would like an opportunity to kind of get feedback about how that's going and see how that has, how that may impact or change outcomes that we're seeing when Matt and Pam work on pretrial evaluations. So we want to allow time for those two things to give us a better sense of what we might need to work on, kind of hold off on those. In the meantime, what we do have opportunities to explore so that we are still at least working towards changes in pretrial. We have an opportunity to validate our pretrial risk assessment. So I believe it's been several years since that has been validated. And we're in talks.
This is Pam again. Just as a matter of clarification, we've never had it validated. So we really think that's an important thing that we need to do.
And so I have reached out to Dr. Alex Holsinger at UMKC, who is, he has done a lot of research around validation of actuarial assessment tools, and that's kind of an area of specialty for him. I talked with him last week about his interest and availability to do this for us, and he's putting together a proposal for what that would look like and timeframe, cost, those sorts of things. So that is an important step. Validating that risk assessment is really important because we are asking for release or detain decisions. We are asking for that risk assessment to be considered when judges are making release or detain decisions. And so we have an opportunity to kind of make sure that any changes are in line with, that we need to make are in line with that. And last week, the Center for Effective Public, oh, go ahead.
This may seem like a silly. Sorry. This is Suzanne Valdez with the DA's office. This may sound like a silly question, but what does the validation process mean? What's the significance of that? And like, what
will
does it
tell us?
entail? Yeah.
So it will involve, so typically what it involves is collection. What we want to know is when we validate the tool, what we want to know is it accurately predicting someone's risk of flight or risk of new criminal activity? Because those are the two things those are the factors that are being assessed when pretrial services completing that assessment and they come out with a risk level. What we need to know is that risk level, that we're accurately assessing that. And it's a lot of what he'll need to use is a lot of, it'll be a lot of data around, he'll essentially take what I'm going to guess that typically the process is all the risk assessments we've ever done, and then the outcomes of those, like of the pretrial phase for each of those defendants, regardless of whether they were on pretrial services or not. So for all of those defendants who came out low risk, were they indeed appearing for all their court appearances for that case that they were assessed low risk on? And did they have any new arrests until that case was disposed?
So does that mean then that will, once you get validation done, that will help inform the DA's office with regard to making bond or OR, anything like that with regard to pretrial
It should
services?
lend confidence
Okay.
that when you all receive, so when your office receives that risk assessment, and you see a defendant is low risk or would fall into that lower level of supervision, it should lend more confidence for you and your staff to feel comfortable with a pretrial services recommendation, or what, to be more in line with those the less restrictive release conditions. And typically risk assessments, we should look at validation of those every 2 to 5 years typically is best practice. So the other thing around pretrial that I would just throw out for you guys to think about, last Tuesday, the Center for Effective Public Policy, who has a pretrial services arm, APPR, the Advancing Pretrial Policy and Research. They are the kind of contracted technical assistance provider for the Arnold Foundation pretrial tool. But in that, they also provide lots of technical assistance around issues related to the pretrial phase. They released an application last Tuesday for free targeted technical assistance in a multitude of areas. Jail population review is one. Lots of different aspects around enhancing pretrial services. Lots of different things that I would suggest we consider. So in the meantime, before locally, we wanted to evaluate or discuss any potential changes around our pretrial practices. That may also be that's something else to think about, because that could inform if we applied and got selected for technical assistance from them, that could help inform any of those changes as well.
This is Pam again. I was just going to add, we're also part of a safety and justice challenge for pretrial work. So we're doing that on 2 different aspects of things that we're doing. And I would also say that validation is recommended even if you're using the Arnold Foundation tool. You want it validated for your jurisdiction. So it wouldn't really matter what tool we're using, but we feel like our stakeholder group, we've tweaked the pretrial practice as much as we're probably going to. And so this is an opportune time for us to validate. Thank you.
And the last thing I would say about validation, hold on. Dang it, I just lost it again. I don't know, it must not have been important. It'll come back to me. Okay. Do you guys have any, anything else here? We ready to? So these are potential, the kind of moving beyond CJCC. The first thing I have kind of suggested here, I think it's important for us to think about how can the CJCC meaningfully support other work that touches those individuals who are involved in our system and with our agencies across the community. How can we serve either as a better conduit for meaningful information sharing so that when there are things going on within domestic violence, for example, or within the community health plan, how can we ensure in a meaningful way that our members here are receiving that information, or that as a CJCC, we can support those efforts? Some of the things there's kind of hidden there. Topics around that. There's been a lot of discussion around driver's license restoration. I know that's an important topic for our municipal court judge. There's been a lot of discussion around that within district court and our self-help center. That's a good example, I feel like, of kind of this cross system touching. Housing is another big area that touches all of the people that we work with, and the community health plan. So those are not exhaustive areas, but as examples of I would like for us to think about how can this group more meaningfully connect and ensure that we're supporting however we can or need to those other efforts across the community.
So I think in some ways what that may look like to this group is that you're going to hear presentations on things that you might occasionally say, how does this necessarily relate to the criminal justice system? But there's a lot of work happening in a lot of other spheres. There's a lot of work happening between the city and the county on homelessness services. So I just want to prepare this group. You're probably going to get some presentations on some things that might seem initially tangentially related, but really are directly related to a whole system of work that's happening.
This is Commissioner Reed. And I'll just add to that on the topic of domestic violence. Both DA Valdez and I, with my other hat on as a Willow advocate, participate in our coordinated community response team. And I'm hoping that this is the year we get a lot more robust, specifically because we are seeking a systems advocate that would be based at Willow to sort of help with coordination and hopefully bring in some technical assistance from Praxis International for a blueprint for safety, which is really about coordinating all the stakeholders from law enforcement to the judges and community-based advocates with what the legal system's response to domestic violence looks like. So I can see that once that gets going, that will be something that we definitely want. There's some crossover in these groups anyway, but CJCC to have awareness of and maybe have some participation in.
And I would add here too with this topic, I know a lot of our law enforcement agencies are also involved in different aspects of I'm not going to put any of y'all on the spot to talk about those, but I know like Lawrence has taken on domestic violence as one, as you all, as the law enforcement kind of builds out how they're involved in their local communities with behavioral health or domestic violence response and those sorts of topics. I think this is also an opportunity to make sure that we give you all a platform as well to kind of share that. The next one, a lot of the work, so continuing support for initiatives at the intersection of behavioral health and criminal justice. This county is well versed in, and you all are well versed in what happens at the very complicated intersection of someone who has behavioral health issues and also finds themselves involved in the criminal justice system. We have this group, a lot of the work that is currently being done and is expanding throughout the community really started here years ago, probably through the work that when we started stepping up, when the county started stepping up. And what that has evolved to is, I think we have heard from Bob a lot, and I think in October, I feel like there was some presentation around we've evolved this into establishing a crisis system roadmap and really building out crisis services and intercept zero of the sequential intercept map. I think CJCC continues to support that, knowing that it evolves. And I think Sarah has more on that.
Yeah, I think, this does sort of is a launching pad from the work that we heard about last year related to the roadmap and the blueprint committee. And then also I'll let Commissioner Reed talk a little bit about the National Association of Counties Familiar Faces Initiative, but county staff is sort of, I think we are honing in on a recommendation around really trying to get a group of stakeholders around the crisis system, which would have many of the players at this table, but maybe some of the players not necessarily at this table. And then also a really strong presence from both law enforcement and emergency medical providers into this whole kind of crisis system, bringing additional players to the table around 988 and some of our other partners in that area, and really trying to focus in on the crisis system. So that's really kind of what we're talking about in this space, and that kind of vague wording. And I think our hope would be to bring back something to keep CJCC engaged in that, but perhaps form even another group that meets separately.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. You said everything I wanted to say. That the Familiar Faces Initiative, it's a National Association of Counties, has elected officials from around the country and different communities kind of at various stages of building up their crisis response. So crisis centers, mobile response teams, the implementation of 988. So, and with a real focus on trying to identify and figure out how to better support the sort of the high utilizers or the familiar faces in the jail, the emergency room, EMS, kind of maybe cycling through courts too. So there's a lot of crossover. I do think it's time in our community that we really figure out a focused group, and there will be communication between this group and that group, I think, and maybe some overlapping folks. But I think it's important to really, this has been a good launch pad for a lot of that work. And now that we have some of those services online that didn't exist in our community before the past 6 months, it's a good opportunity, but I think that there needs to be a strong conduit. And another thing I'm thinking about in that is, recognizing that many of the folks being served in the community by PERT-NASH, DECA, Heartland RADAC, sort of all the sort of crisis systems providers are oftentimes those people have one or more legal issues going on. And so support around how to help with those failure to appear, fines and fees, other, basically court advocacy, which is my job in the domestic violence world. But I think that there's a space for that in other crisis services and community-based services to sort of educate more service providers about how to support folks through court. And part of that is empowering people with information about how the court systems go and being able to talk through that. So that's just a thought that's on my mind about the sort of connect between those spaces.
And those are good launching points into the next kind of topic, building out we already have a fairly expansive data capacity and reporting process. And I would encourage us to push a little more in that space. I think one of the things that Bob, I think, has kind of agreed to use as a starting point for this is he has some ideas around crisis system dashboards that I think he's been working with some of the data collaborative folks to kind of start putting together. But I think as this builds out, this is one of the longer term things that I would just encourage folks to think about moving towards over the course of this year and probably next year. For a lot of our disciplines, we know there's best practice measures, there's kind of standard measures. I think there's opportunities for us to think about how we want to track some of those and how we want to share some of those. I think we have an opportunity to really capitalize on sharing where our systems are doing well and using data to kind of show where we might be having a hiccup and how we're responding to that. So I think that while we have done a lot of really good work in that space, I would encourage us to push ourselves more there. And then the last thing here is more in the purview, obviously the purview of CJCC, but I would suggest reviewing the bylaws of the CJCC and potentially, I think there might be room to make some adjustments. I don't know that they fully reflect how we function today versus the last time, 3 or 4 years ago, maybe.
It's been at least, I think,
I want to say 2019 is the
Yeah, I
last
think it's been
saw.
at least 3 years since we've looked at the bylaws, and I would also just say specifically, I mean, we need to relate it to the expansion of the county commission. So the county commission is going to expand in 2025. Right now, each commissioner has their own appointee. Don't know if we want to add 5. So I just think it's an opportunity to sort of dust those off and to sort of have some feedback about how we make those appointments. And I don't know that we're going to need a separate committee. We might try to do some ways to sort of get some feedback from CJCC members on what their thoughts are and maybe bring suggestions back to the group. But I think it's time to kind of think about who's at the table to be a part of this work.
So Katie, is there a best practices or sort of a template for CJCCs across the country who, like, in terms of their bylaws and infrastructure that we can?
They're different.
Oh, okay. Wow. I
I,
don't want to open, well, I mean, it might be helpful to see what other bodies are
Yeah.
doing, and, you know, to kind of inform any changes or.
I did talk to Justice Management Institute. So when we were selected into the national network of CJCCs, I had my introductory call with them a few weeks ago. And that was one thing that I did ask was how do y'all suggest, folks go about doing this? And they said they've worked with jurisdictions that do it completely differently. Some have a specific work group of CJCC members. There's some where it's been a more facilitated, so you spend a meeting and it's a more facilitated, this is just what we do. That's what we're going to work on in a couple of different meeting sessions. Others have done similar to what Sarah had suggested, where it's kind of staff recommendations and then you walk through those. So there's a lot of templates for approaches and then also things to consider. And I can reach back out to them to see if when they themselves have been involved with the site, helping work through those. I can reach back out certainly to try to get some templates or ideas around what were some of the big points to kind of do that. But just like with most things with CJCCs, it's almost different in every jurisdiction that has one. So
That was my curiosity too. So I appreciate the question. And wondering, maybe it's interesting that there's so much variance, but I suppose our bylaws were, and the work we've been doing were good enough to be accepted into that national network. So I'm curious if there are any, I guess, specific things identified within our bylaws and our structure that are considered best practice or sort of something to keep and hold on to, I suppose, instead of if we do, I don't know that we're going to radically change the bylaws, but just understanding if there's anything that's sort of deemed as ideal from that national network, in addition to what we might add to it.
I will share one of my observations just of our bylaws in my fairly short time here so far. They're very strict related to attendance, related to not being able to send delegates. Things like that are really strict and don't allow a lot of flexibility for our members. And I just get concerned that that's and the response is kind of laid out in the bylaws to things like attendance. I mean, we aren't necessarily, we find ourselves in a tight spot.
Technically, if you miss one meeting, we can kick you off CJCC. And we have not chosen to do that. So it's some of those things that we need to look at.
This is Pam Weegan again. I think as we look at the intersection of behavioral health and criminal justice, we need to talk about some of the same partners at this table will be involved in both. And I'm hoping that there'll be some consideration of doing like every other month so that people aren't drastically inconvenienced by going to the same meetings every month if we're all going to be on those various teams.
You're a great teaser of what is to come, Pam.
Stay
Next
tuned.
slide, please. Yeah.
So I do want to circle back to a couple of things that work that we've already kind of been doing, but that will continue. And I think part of it's important for us to remember and keep some of this in the forefront. We talked earlier, or I shared earlier about all the work that the racial and ethnic disparities has been done, particularly the law enforcement contact study, which we will be continuing, and you all will hear. But initially, I think in November, police law enforcement agencies agreed every 6 months that they would be reporting back out, but we are continuing that with them. As with some of the other topics, I think it's important for us to think about and for this group to really have discussion about how else do we continue in this space? What does this continued work around racial and ethnic disparities look like? We have implemented, and I think Matt does a good job of when he provides evaluations and measures, applying a racial equity lens. We see a lot of our data that is broken out and by race and ethnicity. And I think our expectation is that that would continue. But in this area, is there more? What does that look like moving forward?
I think this is an area where we'd really like to get some feedback from CJCC on what do you think the best approach is? So, we currently have a work group on racial and ethnic disparities, but there's really only one member of CJCC who attends that meeting. And I think we could continue to convene that work group, but we really they need to charge from this group as if that's what we want to do. An alternative proposal, just to think and talk about more, is, how do we embed conversations about race and ethnicity into all of our work, into every conversation, not just a separate committee that houses those conversations. And one of the just ideas, so just an idea to throw out there, is something similar to what we did through Unified Command, where we established equity impact advisors that were a part that participated in each group. So there was somebody specifically designated to talking about, as an equity impact advisor in each group. And then those folks could then get together and sort of share some commonality throughout it. So I just think this is something we'd like a little more direction from you all on as to how to approach that work moving forward. And then also, this is a conversation that I've had with other community leaders and also with the Board of County Commissioners. This community needs larger conversations about race and equity that are larger than just the Criminal Justice Coordinating Council. So how do we do that as a community? How do we convene those conversations? How do we continue them? How do we continue to make progress in this space, all at the same time, not necessarily taking the foot off the gas in terms of the data we're collecting and the advancements we're trying to make? So we'd really welcome your thoughts on how to proceed.
So the next thing, I don't know if y'all want to have that, trying to get a read on it. Are there feedback?
I'll just reiterate that invitation. I think this is something we'd really like to hear feedback, especially from members who have been part of CJCC for quite some time, and kind of what the impact, either bad or good, or maybe not so noticeable to you. We just want to hear that sort of candor about how those conversations have been going. I think in the most recent years, the focus on the law enforcement contact study was sort of the central part of a lot of those conversations. And I think sometimes we can, the thing about having a group that's dedicated to just that is that it can be a little bit siloed. And so my personal opinion is that there's a lens to put on for every one of these topics, every one of these future work groups that we may develop and how to always be looking through that lens in addition to the lens of sort of public safety and folks' access to justice. So really, if anybody has any thoughts they want to share now, please do. If you want to let it percolate and circle back, we really want to hear some candid feedback about how to make this more meaningful throughout all of the work.
Thanks. Patrick Schmitz, Burt Nash. I agree with what you were just saying in terms of how it silos out that conversation, because we've discovered that at our own organization when we're doing our equity work. It's very easy to say, well, let's do a subgroup for this. And it has at times left the decision to others versus the decision where it really needs to be and the action needing to be where it really needs to happen to drive that change throughout the organization. And so I would definitely support that work coming back here to this group. So I think I like that idea.
So I'm go ahead, Brad.
That I think that's, the approach we've taken at the city with the strategic plan and then the commitment areas. That we have the 5 strategic plans, but then we have a commitment to each one of those areas so that it is embedded in each of those. So I think, yeah, that approach makes sense as we're working on some of these, have a commitment to equity in each of those processes makes more sense than separating them out.
So I want to be mindful of time to allow for discussion. So the next thing that I would just add briefly here around what we anticipate continuing is I know a lot of our programs, particularly our specialty courts, have gone through kind of program evaluations that over the years with Matt and the CJS staff, we would anticipate continuing those. And also we are moving more towards expanding or considering how we expand data collection and outcomes or kind of monitoring. This is evolving a little bit, but there's kind of an addition here to a lot of our community partner and service agreements, which are not things that typically, I don't think kind of land here under CJCC for discussion, but there are some agencies that receive funding from the county that do actually kind of touch and fall under the justice umbrella. Truancy is one that comes to mind, and then also Kansas Holistic Defenders is another one. And so I think I anticipate that over the next year or so, there will be movement around kind of the same way that we're evaluating our own programs and our own services, that there will be more of that in those programs, and that we would like to bring that back here. I don't know if I did I bungle that?
Well, I think you did a good job of explaining it, but just to maybe put a little more icing on it, that, the county has spent a lot of time moving from community partner agreements that were pretty basic and straightforward to service agreements and contracts with a number of our human service and community-based providers. Burt Nash has been one of our trailblazers in that area and really developing a strong operating agreement and a strong contract with data measurement. We want to do that, and we're doing that throughout the work at the county that will impact areas and folks that work inside our criminal justice system. So it's really just something that we're trying to do here as a county overall that you might see in a slightly different light. And in many ways incorporates things that CJCC's always done, which is looked at data and has evaluated programs and services. We've done that with behavioral health court. I'd like to do that with drug court and then use that to really create performance measurement so that CJCC and the Board of County Commissioners can be driven by that data to make decisions for program direction and funding. That makes sense.
This next slide is not binding to anybody, but I was trying to create a sense of, so across the bottom, I was trying to create an idea of what some of this work looked like, what I would anticipate. We have a lot that are really longer term or continuing, but there could be, I think there's some fairly short. The competency restoration applies mainly to like the gathering information and figuring out how do we address, not that we will solve competency issues in 5 months. I am not suggesting that that is what happens there. But I was trying to just give a visual of some these ideas were things that could be a mix of this kind of short, mid, and long-term goals as we think about how we move forward over the next 22-ish months. And ideally, a lot of these topics become work groups that are probably more kind of task specific, work on identifying changes that we want to make, kind of implementing them, monitoring them. And we have plenty of material beyond these that once we kind of wrap one thing up and put a bow on it, we have lots of opportunity and lots of good recommendations to kind of go back to and pick something else up. And my last slide that Pam introduced earlier. So I kind of, I would say, I think discussion today, I would kind of toss the question, is this accurate? Do these seem right? Are there things we would want to change? Is this a good starting point? And then also, is there something more? Do you all need more? Do I need to, like, do you all want me to go back and kind of come up with a much more detailed kind of strategic plan or suggestions at this point before we move forward? For next steps, our next meeting is scheduled for March 14th, which is the week of spring break. I know for Lawrence, and I believe for KU. I'm not sure how much that impacts other folks. It may also be the first day of March Madness, which I hear is a thing around here. I'm not familiar.
It is
But-
spring break week, but I don't get spring break anymore.
If we met, if folks were available to meet during that week, what one of my suggestions would be that that gives us time to kind of think of, like, have discussion today, but think about that. And ideally we come back and spend that meeting kind of finalizing where, which members are interested or willing to kind of take lead on some of these. Ideally, we're thinking about forming work groups. I would say when we think about work groups, it does not necessarily have to be all of you sitting around the table or on Zoom if you're in the panel there. But there's opportunities to think about peers or staff that you have who may have particular interests or that you may be able to delegate to lead representing your agency in some of this work. We would also like to get feedback on thinking about meeting every other month. In person, preferably. Ideally kind of starting in March, if folks were available to still meet on that March 14th date. So I feel like now we should maybe think about discussion. Before I leave the podium, I do want to share that for folks. I have copies up here. I have not seen everybody since our December meeting, but I have bound copies of the Vera report for folks that I have not already seen and passed them out. So if you have not already grabbed one, and if I don't have enough, I can see about getting more. So I think I would kind of open that or leave that. That's all I had. And I would kind of toss to you all to kind of give us direction for moving forward from here. Sharing the end.
Thank you, Katie. Do we have anybody who has any feedback or input from either the Zoom group or the people here in the room?
This is Suzanne Valdez from the DA's office. Katie, I want to thank you for all of the hard work you put into this presentation. I know that you've spent, like you indicated, the last probably 6 to 8 weeks just talking with people and then circling back again, doing your due diligence to try to come up with your suggestions. So all of what you said is not a surprise to me. In fact, we've had those discussions. And my question for you is the idea then that depending on, sounds like you've got them prioritized and timelines, I'm guessing. I don't know, maybe not. Maybe that's something we need
They
to
were-
talk about. Maybe
they're
they're all
suggestions.
happening, leaving the train station at the same time. But the idea being that, I guess, in March, we'll come together and come up with the game plan. Is that
Yeah,
the
that-
idea?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I was trying to think without overwhelming everybody with all sorts of stuff for the first time in an hour and a half. Trying to give as much information for you all to think about, but that could also be informative. And these are all, everything that I had presented is, I mean, merely suggestion. It's, CJCC is the one thing that they all do have in common is that they, to be successful, they're all really driven by their members. So you all really drive. I look to you all to drive this, and to kind of give me and the rest of the county staff kind of direction in this space. So, so these were just things to kind of start with and think about.
This is Commissioner Reed. Thank you, Katie. I know, as DA Valdez said, you have been doing a lot of work to have diligent conversations with folks. And probably most everybody that's here. So I would just invite CJCC members to really think through these more, and identify anything that, these sort of last questions are, is there anything that feels not quite right, or like it's not accurately reflected? Is there stuff missing that you feel is really important to your agency and the work of this committee and the community? And just, between now and March 14th, give that feedback directly to Katie if you want, or come ready to that meeting to really talk about what stands out to you, both positive or negative. If you think that there's something that's not really a top priority, or that's really not really an issue, we want to hear that too. So, and certainly welcome any immediate thoughts anybody has over here, but understand the benefit of a little bit of time to let things settle in and maybe dig into that Vera report more if you haven't already, just to think about what makes sense and what. My goal would be that we are really able to identify sort of those refreshed work groups, and each person on CGCC, what their particular interest is, and then being able to, like Katie said, identify other folks in your organization or office that might be a good person, an extra conduit of information to have participate in those, because they've been a mixture of both CJCC members and community members at large in the past. And I think that is workable, but we want to start with folks here and what sort of those big interests are, and focus areas for each of you in your offices.
Yes, in addition to CJCC members, it's oftentimes people on your staffs or teams. So, we've had work groups led by folks in Pam's office and other teams. So like, this is a chance to not only delegate, but groom additional folks, or to for additional levels of responsibility. So it's a way to kind of get folks in your organization maybe more engaged. And I think to focus efforts, the first slide there that talked about the three that we're thinking about most immediate are probably the areas where we'd look to form work groups on most immediately. So if you're taking the slides and taking a look at them, I think that's kind of what we're thinking.
Yeah, and the slides, I will be adding the slides to the meeting invitation after this, and then they'll also be posted on the website. So so that by this afternoon, they'll be accessible for you all to refresh yourselves with that.
And for the low hanging fruit, we're very interested what you think about bi-monthly meetings beyond March. So if anybody wants to offer up their thoughts on that.
I'm absolutely in favor of that. There's no question about it.
I figured that would- Okay.
Yeah, yeah. As more and more obligations happen, it's good to try to limit some of that. And the idea of being able to hand off to some of my staff who are far more intelligent and well-versed in some of these areas, and therefore are going to better serve the work groups and our work overall. I like that idea. And I think you've done some really good work here, Katie. So thank you.
Mike Patrick, Baldwin City. I also support going to the every other month as well. I do not have a large staff, so it does rely on me to kind of make as many as I can. So it is helpful to me if we do that. I'm also not available for the March meeting, so I will try to send someone in my place if that's allowable.
Yeah.
Which I think by the bylaws it's
Yeah.
not, but
Is there significant opposition to, I know that this is not probably the most comfortable or ideal kind of setup, but is there opposition to in person when we do have meetings? I just would share, I feel like it just creates a better kind of dynamic and more opportunity for conversation that we miss. Okay.
That being said, we will probably always record them and show them live on Zoom so that members of the public can, because this is an open meeting, and so that we can broadcast it and sort of have that transparency. But I do think it will be helpful to get around a table and have these discussions and have some lunch.
Pam, this is Pam again. Thanks everybody for your input. I want to provide an opportunity for public comment. Do we have anyone in the room or on Zoom who would like to ask questions or provide input? Come on up.
Actually, why don't you have her go to there to
The podium.
the podium.
Thank you.
And we're gonna kind of time vote just to stay under 3 minutes is we're gonna.
Thank you. My name's Terry Wilkie. I'm a member of Justice Matters. I've met many of you. I'm very glad to be here. I wanted to add, the only thing I think this is good work. And the only thing I want to add is let's pretend someone is in jail and they have an outstanding warrant on an offense other than what they're being jailed for. And so then they serve their time and they're thinking, okay, I'm going to be released. And then the authorities say, and now you get to address this outstanding warrant. And so really, if people are aware within the system that there are things to work out with people, that would be helpful. And then I ask everyone who is a member of this group, city, county, to address the way you train your staff. I was lucky to go to the county's released from jail now, what are you going to do thing at the fairgrounds. It was an eye-opening experience. And at break time, and they said, okay, public comment. And I said, hello, why is everyone so rude to me? Here I am, I've got my transportation vouchers, I've got my expectations, I'm trying to do it, and every place I go. And I used to work for the government. I'm retired now, but I know how it gets when you have a lot of work to do and you want to start being not so helpful with people. So I do encourage everyone to train their employees and set standards for performance that are like you're helping, it's public assistance. You're helping people within what you do, your jobs you do. Thank you.
Thank you. Yep, come on up.
I hope you don't mind hearing from one other person from Justice Matters. My name is Marty DuBois, and I really want to commend Katie and Pam, you jumping in too to fill in the gaps. A really nice presentation. I was real heartened that the 3 issues that seem to come to the top of what we're most interested in, and that is review of the jail population, failure to peer, and also the probation violations, attacking those, it appears that they're being prioritized. And I think I really am thankful for that. And for one of the reasons is, well, the whole reason for doing that is to move people from that position that maybe don't need to be in jail, and to reduce the population, reduce bookings and reduce the length of stay. And I'm glad to see that that's being attacked, because, the proposal to do a major renovation in the county jail may be impacted. There needs to be renovation for equity on the treatment of all people incarcerated. But this could have an impact on the extent of the renovation. So get after it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Do we have anybody online?
Not at this time, no.
Thank you, Zena. Do we have anything else for the good of the order today? Seeing none, this meeting is adjourned. Our next meeting in the CJCC is March 14th. I'll see you all then. Thank you.